afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us today for our final session of day 2 of International Programs International Symposium. My name is Kevin Noe, and it is my honor today to welcome you to Challenges to Rural Resilience in Japan and France, a comparative study. Today, our presenter is Natalie Montecino. She's an undergraduate student in the International Studies program. For everyone joining us today, please note that there is a Q&A box in the Zoom, probably down below, and ask questions at any time throughout the presentation. Additionally, some portions of this presentation may be interactive, and using the Q&A box will work very similarly to the chat box. So please feel free to participate. Additionally, closed captioning is available, so do turn that on if you desire. And finally, there will be a short survey after this session. If you do have a moment, please complete that. So with that, I would like to now turn it over to Natalie.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kevin. Hi again, everybody. My name is Natalie Montecino, and as Kevin said, I'm going to be discussing challenges to rural resilience in Japan and France, which is a comparative study. Oops, if I can get to the next slide. There we go. And I don't know if there's any people here that I haven't met with before, but I just thought I'd give a little bit of info about me in case you don't know who I am. I'm in my 4th year of undergraduate study here at CSU, and I'll be graduating in May. My major is international studies with an Asian concentration, and I've been quadruple minoring in Japanese, French, political science, and international development. Where I'm from, I'm a Colorado native, so born and raised here in Colorado, but both of my parents are from rural Louisiana, and I spent a lot of time there growing up. So hopefully my areas of study and my family heritage make it a little more clear why I'm interested in the research topic that I chose to present with you guys today. And I also wanted to take a moment to acknowledge 2 of the professors that have helped advise my research here at CSU. And those professors are Dr. Andrea Duffy and Dr. Mary Vogel. They have both been so instrumental in my completion of this project, and I couldn't be more grateful for the support they've given me over the past year. And I began this research back in January of 2021 as an independent study with Dr. Duffy, which I then transitioned into a larger project for my honors thesis. So it's been about a year now since I've been working on all this. And I'm continuing to revise my paper to hopefully prepare it for journal submission later this semester, fingers crossed. And after graduation, I'm hoping to spend a year in Japan conducting research. I'd like to intimately study rural life and conduct interviews with people that are living in villages there. And then after that, hopefully on to graduate school to pursue a degree either in geography or development studies. Not entirely sure yet, but somewhere in that field. All right, and I think that's a pretty good introduction. So before I begin, I thought I would ask everybody here to take a moment to answer the following question. What do you know about rural decline? And this can be about anywhere. It doesn't have to be Japan or France related. Where is it happening? Is it a good or bad thing? Why is it happening? Anything at all related to rural decline. And you should be able to submit a quick 1-sentence response or so by using the Q&A function that's on screen, which should allow me and everybody else to see it. So I'll give everybody a second to just send in a quick response and see what people know about rural decline. Maybe I have to pose a question. Oh, nothing. Awesome. Getting a couple people in. It's happening everywhere. Populated areas, move of urbanization. Yeah, these are some great answers. Thank you, everybody, for taking a second to submit those. I'm going to move ahead, and with these ideas in mind, I'm hoping my presentation will fill out some of those details and add a little bit more complexity to what we already know about rural decline. So we'll move on. Oops. All right, I thought I would set the tone for my presentation by sharing this quick video with you guys. It's about a town called Nagoro, and it's located in Shikoku Prefecture of Japan. And this particular village has faced such intense population decline that one of the remaining residents has started to replace people with scarecrows, if that's what you'd like to call these, or human-like dolls, just to make the town feel alive again despite its dwindling numbers. So I'm going to go ahead and show this video.
I heard of this Japanese town that replaced humans with scarecrow-esque dolls known as kakashi. Hundreds of them. Naturally, I had to go and see it for myself. This is Nagoro Village. Tucked into a valley on the island of Shikoku, the village has developed a bit of a personality. It's filled with over 300 of these dolls spread throughout the village. They are everywhere. Some more obvious than others, each one often representing a real person with a name, age, and a personal history. And incredibly, nearly each and every one is handmade by a single person. In 2002, when Ayano Tsukimi returned to the village from living in Osaka, many of the people she knew were long gone, and in time, she found herself populating the village with these kakashi dolls. As these things often do, it started with a single doll to stand as a scarecrow and protect a field. But more on Ayano-san in just a minute. As with many places around the world, Japan's countryside towns and villages are struggling to maintain any sense of appeal to the younger generation who would all rather live in the big cities. Nagoro Village is a shining example of this, with only 27 remaining residents, all of whom are close to or past retirement age. And unsurprisingly, there are no children. The local elementary school, while upkept, has been abandoned for over 20 years now. We had the chance to enter the gymnasium.
この人形っていうのは毎年いろんなテーマを作ってやってて、で去年は運動会いうような形、これが綱引きって言うんだけどね、これ全部綾野さんって人が作るんだけどね、その前の年が阿波踊りだ、祭りっていう題で。
The scale of this entire thing really starts to hit you when you see the gymnasium. And when he points out once again that all of this is made by a single person,
これ全部綾野さんって人が作るんだけどね。
it all becomes vastly more impressive in every way. The detail that goes into each and every one of them is mind-boggling.
Oops, that was muted. Perfect. So I think that gives us a bit of an idea of what we're looking at in Japan specifically. Oops. And well, as far as I know, there aren't any scarecrow villages in France. There are places like Goussainville, which is pictured here, which has earned the title of a ghost town, despite the fact that people still live there because of its rapid population decline. I believe this village in particular only has around 150 remaining residents. All right. So with these preliminary pictures of rural life in mind, I want to share my thesis statement with you. And my thesis statement is that the unique histories and geography of both Japan and France have placed them in a position of unsustainable rural development. However, by harnessing both countries' unique identities, rural populations can be revitalized and village life preserved. All right, and so now I'd like to first preview the preliminary points that I'm going to discuss today. I'm going to begin with some background information, including a literature review, a discussion of global trends, and a very brief history since 1945. Then I'll move on to current economic and cultural challenges, and I'll conclude with solutions and ideas for future research. All right, beginning with the background section, I'd like to provide a quick overview of what the available scholarly literature looks like as it relates to rural decline in these two countries. And so rural life and transformation is a pretty popular topic for both Japan and France, in particular Japan. So there exists a relatively large body of available literature discussing what's going on. However, that being said, many sources present largely expository information on rural transformation. And that's to say that a critical analysis and discussion of contemporary rural decline is much more challenging to come by. Similarly, there are almost no sources that directly compare Japan and France together in regard to their rural situations. Occasionally, the two will be lumped together with a handful of other countries for one broad study, but there's little to no analysis of their direct similarities and differences, of which I think there are some very striking ones. And so for this reason, I believe that my study will help to fill a gap in the available literature while also promoting cross-regional analysis that will be crucial to rural preservation efforts moving forward. And next, I'd also like to discuss a few of the global trends for rural populations. As a couple of you mentioned in the Q&A section at the beginning, modernization, industrialization, and urbanization have been occurring on a global scale for quite some time now, which has ushered in an era of very intense rural decline across the globe. Additionally, factors such as the movement of young people away from rural areas, a growing divide between rural and urban living standards, stagnating economies, loss of countryside investment opportunities, and city-centered policies have further accelerated that decline. In this slide here, I have a graph for you guys that shows a UN projection of the global divide between urban and rural populations up to the year 2050. Highlighting how rapidly this gap has and will continue to grow. And focusing on Japan and France specifically, this graph here shows the decline of rural populations since 1960, with France being the green line and Japan being the blue line. Finally, I'd like to provide a really brief historical overview, as well as some geographical information that situates my argument in a relevant context, I think. For both Japan and France, they planted the seeds of industrialization, urbanization, and consumerism in the years following the start of the Meiji Restoration and the French Revolution, respectively. It was during the start of these transformative eras that sprawling urban centers developed, suddenly inundated by people who wanted to work in new factories and industries situated in those urban centers. International ideals, particularly consumeristic and capitalistic ones, infiltrated these nations, bringing with them the start of the abandonment of tradition. These trends steadily grew, reaching new heights after World War II, when both nations entered an economic miracle of their own right. It was at this time that society was nearly fully transformed, and life became much more concentrated than city centers, more so than ever before. Traditional sectors like agriculture were modernized, and an emptying of the countryside ensued as available rural jobs rapidly declined. All right, so moving into a discussion of economic challenges that Japan and France rural populations are facing today, I'm going to be using a series of graphs to support my points. So, as a continuation of the problems of the mid-20th century, Japan's rural communities today are struck by something experts in the field are calling an agricultural adjustment problem. The adjustment problem happens when rural sectors are unable to compete with modern industrialized markets for labor and manufactured goods, nor with the import of food and raw materials from abroad. In 2018, based on data from Japan's GDP, agriculture accounted for only 1.14% of the national economy, whereas industry accounted for just under 30% and the service sector around 69%. With such a marginal contribution, it's unsurprising that Japan is one of the largest importers of agricultural goods in the world. And in 2013 alone, they imported over $60 billion worth of agriculture goods. And the Japanese agricultural sector is just no longer viable on a large scale, and remaining workers struggle to match global market prices. From a profit perspective, this essentially renders their work obsolete. And this graph here is related to France's GDP. So when examining the data related to France's agricultural sector, it becomes evident that both Japan and France are facing very similar concerns today. According to information derived from France's GDP, which you can see here, agriculture accounts for roughly 1.6% of the nation's production, and this number has remained relatively unchanged since the early 2000s. And despite being one of the major agricultural importers or exporters, excuse me, in the European Union, the massive gap between commercial farmers and small family farmers is a large reason for France's agricultural problems today. There certainly have been a few EU-wide policies designed to specifically aid small farmers by introducing new markets. An example of this could be the EU Common Agricultural Policy. However, in actuality, it's only served to broaden the gap between commercial and family farmers further. The reason for this is because additional markets can only create a finite amount of demand, the majority of which is quickly satisfied by the nation's commercial farms. France has even had issues of overproductivity in the agricultural sector as a result of the post-war mechanization of farm technology, which has resulted in a surplus of products such as dairy, beef, or wine. And as farm technology advances, it becomes easier to create more with less effort. To manage this problem, quotas were placed on certain products like the ones I mentioned earlier. And it was relatively difficult for small farmers who typically specialize on one product to get by on their normal production alone. This ultimately pushed a large percentage of the rural population into urban areas to seek supplemental income. And unfortunately, many of them never went back. All right. And for Japan, this notion of the declining capacity of the agricultural sector is further reflected by employment data. In 2020, Japan's agricultural sector accounted for roughly 3.3% of total employment within the country, a small figure that has already dropped close to an entire percentage point in the past 10 years alone. So clearly, it's nearly impossible to find non-commercial agricultural employment in rural areas, thus forcing rural residents to seek alternative types of employment either within those rural areas or in urban centers. However, a generally stagnating economy and declining population rate, coupled with limited opportunities for future development, has led many residents to choose the latter. And in 2020, France's agricultural sector accounted for about 2.3% of total employment within the country, which is a figure that's even smaller than Japan's. And so while France's agricultural employment rate used to be fairly stable, the past 7 years, as you can see in this graph here, have been characterized by steady decline that doesn't seem to be stopping. And so some might argue that it's to be expected for commercial production to occupy a greater proportion of rural employment in two highly developed nations such as France and Japan. But the issue is the fact that it's created a generally inhospitable economic environment for greater rural populations. That's to say that if both Japan and France want to revitalize and repopulate their rural areas moving forward, a sentiment that's been reflected in both countries in recent national and local policy, then they first have to battle a major rural economic readjustment. Future technologies and further agricultural mechanization will only challenge and limit remaining agricultural employees, both commercial and non-commercial, begging the question of where do we resituate rural employment moving forward? So while economic struggles are probably the most tangible indicators of rural hardship for both Japan and France, rural cultural decline has also proven to generate a lot of struggle. So that's what I'm going to be discussing in this next section. But before delving into the broader implications of cultural decline, its former significance should first be established. So in both Japan and France, rural culture has served as a fundamental historic foundation for national identity and community building. Perceptions of the countryside, both imagined and real, have helped to curate a nationwide idea of what it means to be Japanese or what it means to be French. And given the strong regional and geographic diversity of both Japan and France, the nationalization of rural identity served further to create a sense of unity and belonging within the state. To this point, rural imagery has been propagated by both the Japanese and French governments historically and in more recent times. The exact reason for government emphasis on rural culture varies depending on the era in which it was implemented, but the building of nationalism and a centralized national identity have often served as incentive. However, the continued promotion and development of rural culture is stagnating in many of the same ways that rural economies are. In Japan, rural villages and towns are by and large populated by elderly people, with one study indicating that there are somewhere between 250 to 300 hamlets fully populated by people aged 75 years or older. The nation has been struggling with declining birth rates and an aging population for many years now, which you can see on this graph here. The effects of which are most clearly seen in those rural areas where death rates far surpass birth rates. And a declining birth rate means that culture is being passed on to fewer and fewer people. And with the majority of the Japanese population being concentrated in large cities, stewards of rural or traditional culture in particular are growing few and far between. In the past, multi-generational households were common, and it was expected that the younger generation would remain in the village to take care of the elders. However, in the 21st century, that aspect of family culture has changed. Over the course of Japan's modernization and urbanization, young people left the household to pursue work and education in the cities, often leaving behind their parents or grandparents with no firm plans to ever return. However, today, there are a number of young people who are interested in returning to the countryside, but those people with that interest are kind of unable to secure unemployment or even find a sense of belonging in these elder-dominated villages where the local population is so unstable. So as a result, new businesses are quick to shut down, and many villages have been abandoned after the last of their residents have died. Although less extreme than complete village abandonment in most cases, France also struggles with maintaining a younger generation in rural areas, thanks to a shift away from traditional culture. Farming was once a family business, and the management of the farm was passed from one generation to the next. However, rural culture has again shifted away from this dynamic, and roughly 40% of farm managers today are aged over 55, which is past the retirement age in France. A declining birth rate is proving to be a growing problem for France, as indicated by this graph here. You can see France is the green line and Japan is the blue line, just for comparison. So as the number of young people born in the countryside dwindles and there's no clear plan for revitalization, one is forced to wonder who's going to maintain rural culture when the current residents are gone. Rural culture is such a broad and encompassing concept that its decline and loss is difficult to fully imagine. Imagine things like food or language dialects, music, rituals, all of these things will slowly fade from the collective consciousness, stripping the Japanese people and the French people of a quintessential element of their national identities. Cultural decline and economic decline move in tandem, highlighting the increasingly dire and complex situation of rural populations today. All right, so although the situation might seem rather grim, I'd like to now move into a discussion of potential solutions and areas of future research that I've identified over the course of this year that I've been working on this project. All right, so in an effort to answer the question that I have over on the left in the circle, how can rural populations be revitalized in Japan and France, I've identified 5 key areas where change is necessary. And those are access to public services, employment, business, and personal prospects, housing and business subsidies, reimagination of rural identity, and campaigns for domestic travel. One of the primary disparities that has prevented young people in particular from moving into rural areas is a lack of development and access to resources. And this is something that a couple of you mentioned in the Q&A. Basic necessities by urban standards at least, such as cell service or reliable transportation or even medical care, are often scarce in rural areas. And without these basics, there's naturally few employment, business, or personal prospects. And I have a really great video to share with you guys here that kind of highlights the importance of public services in France. So I'm going to share that now.
It's spring in the village of Varzy in central France, but this shuttered bakery still sports Christmas decorations, and on deserted streets, For sale signs outnumber passers-by.
You get used to it. After 3 years here, I'm used to it. But at first I had a hard time. I didn't dare go out because I thought I wouldn't see anyone.
Shrinking populations in small towns and cities is a problem throughout rural France. As young people leave and fail to return, so do services, even essential ones like medical care.
If you get sick in Varzy, you have to realize we only have 2 doctors. One of them is sick right now and can't work. And no one wants to take any new patients because they're overworked. And there are no more doctors.
No more doctors and none coming to replace the ones retiring. Like other young professionals, new GPs have little interest in settling in Varzy. Pascal Gleitz, who used to practice there, knows the challenges of serving rural communities firsthand.
You completely take on this role of the doctor at the service of the population. You don't track your hours, you try to be available, and you don't protect yourself.
Today, Dr. Gleitz is in a suburb of the small city of Nevers. A 2-hour train ride from Paris, Nevers' larger population means more doctors and more services. But even this town needs young professionals and new businesses to survive. In a creative short-term move, the city has started simply covering empty storefronts with window dressings. The mayor's long-term plan involves attracting tech startups and pushing for high-speed rail service, but those efforts require investment beyond the local level, and those waiting for change don't see anyone taking an interest.
I think politicians, the countryside, they kind of don't care about it. They take care of their city problems. It's been neglected for years, and now the problem is here, and we have to deal with it.
For now, that means long drives for doctors' visits, and hoping, as they watch their neighbors leave and take their votes with them, that some will remain to speak out.
Perfect. So yeah, I think this is a really great video that emphasizes a lot of the problems with not having access to public services. And oops, there we go. I also have another fun video. This one's about Japan. And this is in reference to my third key point, which is housing and business subsidies. It's kind of a funny video. So I'm going to show you it, and it talks about Japan's most recent rural housing campaign.
In the hillsides outside of Tokyo is the quaint village of Okutama, Japan.
So this house is empty?
Hi. And Masahiro Yamada has what is probably the most important job in town.
All of these homes the town's giving away?
His binder lists all of the empty and abandoned homes in Okutama, which he then gets to give away.
If somebody wants to come live here, they potentially could get this house for free.
He says, yes, if you live in the house for 15 years, we will give it to you for free.
That's a really good deal.
Yes, he says, we want people to settle here. Okutama isn't generous, it's desperate. In recent decades, it's lost half of its population. The main street is lined with closed storefronts. Most of the people who still live here have what you might call senior status. Zero. And at the local school, the entire third grade has just 6 kids. Not so long ago, there were dozens. So at Town Hall, the race is on to find new residents. Yamada has even resorted to playing Cupid.
So you fixed up a couple and then you gave them this house as a gift to get them to move here?
Yes, he says, we also gave them the house.
Anything to get people to move here?
We do it all.
All right, perfect. So yeah, a very interesting campaign, a very intimate campaign in some ways, attempting to bring people into this village. And so I guess my commentary on this would be that although subsidies have brought in new residents, I believe later in this video they say that about 500 people have moved to Okutama after this housing campaign started. This really only solves half of the problem, right? The process of moving into a previously abandoned home in an economic vacuum without the promise of job security or local resources is undoubtedly very daunting. And I think it's pretty unrealistic to expect newcomers to be able to sustain themselves without employment, business, or personal prospects, nor does it really serve to benefit the larger goal of rural revitalization and the creation of resilience. And so I guess I'd like to ask all of you, would you be willing to make the move to this village for a free house? Is that enough for you? Or would you need something else to convince you to stay for 15 years, which is the contract for this particular housing campaign? I think it's a very interesting question to ask yourself. And then we'll move on to the next one. Oops. I'll play it again. There we go. I just have one more video. I think these are a really great way to see sort of what the situation looks like in both Japan and France from a realistic perspective, rather than me just telling you about it. So improving access to resources alone is not going to reverse current trends of decline. I think there also needs to be, which is my fourth point, a reimagination of what it means to be a rural resident in the 21st century, which I think this video here about France sort of explains in a good way. So I'll play that now.
Since the 19th century, the French countryside has been the victim of a rural exodus. But in recent years, this trend has seemingly begun to reverse. Ecological awareness and the desire for a healthier lifestyle, far from the bustle of the big cities, is drawing a new generation to remote regions in search of a more meaningful life.
Sandwiches? What should we do for today's dish? How about cottage pie?
That was the choice of these two young women when they took over the village grocery store. Pauline worked in the food industry, and Anna had just completed law school. They dropped everything to embark on an adventure full of meaning, but one that's far from being a smooth ride.
We didn't realize when we started how many different jobs there were and how long they would take, etc. But I think everyone's a bit naive at first. When your baby wakes you up 3 times a night and then you have to get up to start work at 6 o'clock and embark on a 15-hour day, for sure you think, why didn't I opt for a 35-hour week in a little company with days off and so on?
Over the months, the two young women have discovered the harsh realities of their work.
When we started, we had no idea how much cooking would be involved. It's never been a passion of mine, and it still isn't.
But you've had to learn on the job.
Exactly.
They called their store Todo Loco, meaning totally nuts in Spanish. And you need to be nuts to hurl yourself into the unknown.
Ground duck meat.
Opened a year and a half ago, it's the only store in this village of 1,200 inhabitants.
What's really great is having so many different things here. Plus, there's the atmosphere, which is very friendly.
Good produce and their kindness. They're a couple of angels.
Their motto, to offer a maximum of produce from the region.
I love it when it's well presented.
And honest, homemade food.
We wanted it to be different than a regular store/tobacconist. That wasn't our dream. We didn't play shops when we were little. We felt driven to do something different, to give the village store some of its nobility back.
We always tell our customers about our suppliers' websites. We want local producers to be able to make a living and uphold their values, which we share with them.
All right, and I think that's a very interesting depiction of two young people that made the move into a rural village. So as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, villages and small towns in both Japan and France are currently dominated by older populations. The current rural lifestyle and available amenities are not well suited for younger generations in a lot of senses. However, for the young people in this video, they were able to reimagine a place and sense of belonging for themselves in their respective villages. A reimagination of rural identity includes making a space for young people to build their lives, as well as a shift in the narrative of what rural life is. Currently, in both Japan and France, rural life is associated with poverty, economic stagnation, and loneliness. If these nations hope to revitalize the countryside, this image will need to be reshaped into one that can garner respect, admiration, and even envy from urban dwellers. And I think there's a number of ways that this could be explored in a modern context, one such being through the marketing of nostalgia. The idea of returning to one's roots and calling upon the collective identity of old can be very provocative. All right. One campaign in particular that has the potential to cater to the marketing of nostalgia is happening in Japan right now, and it's called the Go To Travel campaign. This campaign allows anyone to claim a voucher for domestic travel within Japan with monetary compensation ranging from roughly $100 to $200 a day. And there's numerous businesses that are partnering with Go To Travel to offer flight and hotel packages and things like that, but people wanting to plan their own trips can still claim vouchers. And the goal of this campaign is to promote domestic travel to more rural areas, both as a response to COVID-19, as well as to encourage Japanese citizens to explore parts of the country that they might not have otherwise ventured to. And while results of this campaign are yet to be fully seen, I think this is an excellent way to promote promote rural travel and provide the population with a low-stakes opportunity to reimagine what rural life looks like for themselves. And of course, it's also a wonderful opportunity to stimulate local economies as well. And I think this could work very well in France, although as far as I know, there are currently no domestic travel campaigns in place that mimic this one or anything like that, but I think it has some really great potential. And so, after spending a year studying these issues, I've identified some areas of future research that I hope to explore at some point in my own academic career, and that maybe some of you will be interested in. First, I'd like to do an in-depth analysis of rural policy and its actual effects on the intended populations. I think this analysis could be beneficial to more concretely determine what the role of government in rural preservation and revitalization is. So in that sense, I mean, what role should the national government be playing and what role should local governments be playing? What's the ratio there? I'd like to explore that a little further. And then I'd also like to identify and analyze more cross-regional countries with similar rural challenges and characteristics. I believe this could be really beneficial in determining more specific global and regional trends that would create a basis for potentially even international work. So I'm curious to know what types of international organizations could improve these situations, or if grassroots efforts would be the most effective. There hasn't been a lot of work done into how to reshape rural areas, so I'm really curious about what that could look like. And so, as I conclude my presentation, I quickly want to reflect on why I wanted to share this all with you today. First, rural decline is happening everywhere. I spent last semester traveling around Colorado to meet and document the stories of rural populations in our own communities here. And it's really getting harder and harder to maintain these lifestyles. So the issues that I discussed today don't just pertain to Japan and France. And secondly, I want to encourage you all to go explore the countryside, whether it's here in Colorado or in France. And support the local economies while you're there. You can really make a difference. And then finally, for those of you that still have some time left at CSU, I would really encourage you to consider doing an independent study with a professor that you like. This was a truly meaningful experience for me and has given me such a clear direction for how I want to continue my academic journey after I graduate from CSU. And that's everything. So thank you all so much for taking the time out of your day to watch my presentation. I'm very grateful for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about this project or what I've learned through my research. And I did see there were a couple of questions in the chat while I was presenting, so I might address those now. Jose and Lauren, new technologies, how are they affecting rural? Okay, virtual work. So I'm seeing remote work and virtual work. I think those are really interesting developments. And while I do agree that having a remote job that you could do would probably enable a lot of people to travel into the countryside and sort of live that idyllic life out on the out in the country, the problem comes again with the issue of public services. So in order to do your remote job, you need to have a reliable internet connection. And a lot of these places don't have cell service, don't have internet connection, and so you can't do that virtual work there. I think these things have a lot of great potential, but there has to be major updates to what amenities are available out in the countryside first. And then Mary asked if I have any information on how COVID has affected rural populations. Absolutely. There are major impacts happening right now. So basically all of the problems I addressed here economically and culturally have been kicked into hyperdrive because of COVID. So if pre-pandemic, we were already having problems getting people to go to the countryside and visit these places and engage in these local economies, now more than ever, when travel is already restricted, people aren't choosing to go there. And of course, there are people that are like, oh, I should go to the countryside to stay away from the crowds. Sure, there are a few people like that, but if we're looking at major trends, rural travel has dropped off even more so as a result of COVID, making these problems even more dire. So hopefully there can be some change occurring in the near future to salvage these communities before it's too late. All right, and then the next question is, do you think that if people were offered houses in rural Colorado communities, would those efforts be as successful as in Japan? Especially since the housing markets are incredibly high in Colorado as it is. I think that's a really interesting question. I'm inclined to say yes. I think it would be successful. And the reason I'm inclined to say that is because I think Colorado is probably more connected than Japan is, in the sense that our rural areas are probably less rural than some of Japan's rural areas. You know, many people in the States have cars, so if they need to go on a longer trip to get groceries, they have their personal car and they can do that more easily than someone in Japan, where cars are not as prevalent, being sort of stuck and isolated. So I think there would probably be a lot of people interested in living in more rural areas because they know they have the capacity to commute. So yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. Will you continue your research in Colorado? Lauren asked if I'll continue that. I would love to. I'm planning on leaving for Japan sometime in September if everything goes well, but the time that I spent last semester traveling around Colorado was wonderful. I went primarily to Southern Colorado, and I met some very resilient people that have a lot of pride in their communities and have put in so much work to revitalize their communities there. So I would love to meet with more of these people. I also started working with the Rural Journalism Institute of Southern Colorado. Sorry, it's a bit of a long title, but I wrote an article for them as a guest journalist, and I conducted interviews at a hospital in Southern Colorado that has really had to step up their game during COVID to serve the rural population, because the larger hospitals that people typically traveled to were inundated with COVID patients and they couldn't get in. So rural hospitals really had to step up in Colorado over the past couple of years to serve rural populations. So that was a very interesting dynamic to see, and I would love to explore it more. Thank you for the question, Lauren. And Mary asks, do you have any insights on the possibility of France, China opening their rural areas to immigrants from other places? In the US, many farm workers are immigrants, and our system is set up to work that way. I think my answer would be different for the two. Actually, I think this is one of the differences between France and Japan in terms of their rural populations. Historically, Japan has been fairly anti-immigration. I believe only 2% of the population, it might be a little bit more now, but about 2% of the population is immigrant, which is very small compared to somewhere like France, which has a much higher immigrant population. So that being said, I think France could benefit from bringing in immigrants, but the issue is less so that we don't have enough workers to work in these places and more so that we don't have jobs in these places. Agricultural jobs in particular have been swept up by the commercial industry, and there's not really a place for it anymore. So there would need to be a shift in what commercial monopolies look like in the agricultural sector, I think. And I believe that is the end of my session. But yeah, thank you all so much. I had a wonderful time chatting with you all and presenting today.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for such a wonderful presentation. And thank you to everyone that is in attendance this afternoon for all of your wonderful questions and for being here at the end of day 2 of the International Symposium. I would like to remind you that if you have a moment, please complete the survey after we close this Zoom room. And do remember, we have another day of sessions tomorrow. Everything is virtual through Zoom. Please see our website for more information. Again, thank you, Natalie. Thank you to everyone in attendance, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone.